Oh, nice. Is it a new video game?
What? Oh no, it's just a virtual tabletop. I thought it might be something cool for our next online session.
Ah, okay. But isn't it still a video game then? I mean, look at it.
No, it isn't. It's the same as playing at the table.
You sure?
Actually, I'm not. In recent years, many tabletop role-playing systems that preceded modern RPG video games as inspiration have experienced a resurgence in their general popularity. In doing so, they leaped forward to match their spiritual digital successors in using modern virtual methods. We are talking about classic pen and paper role-playing games, such as Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, Cyberpunk, or The Black Eye, also called Das Schwarze Auge. It is common for all of them to be played by a group of people at a table. The only accessories are often the name-giving pens and papers. In some enthusiastic groups, however, miniatures and landscape models can also be used to create an immersive surface for the gameplay, as long as one is willing to make this investment. But the most important tool of them all are certainly the dice. If the rulebooks are sometimes hundreds of pages long and quickly reach into the thousands of pages with any extended works and supplements, all of these game systems have so far lived from the simplicity of the presentation technique. Apart from paper and pencil, these parlor games were first and foremost designed in the creative minds of the players. Today, however, they are increasingly being played with neither paper nor pen. Even if the physical version of these games will continue to prevail, there's no getting around the fact that there is an increase in online players, or online rounds for that matter, especially in times of a pandemic. The attention towards virtual tabletops seems to continue to increase. These VTTs represent a digital tool or program that allows various pen and paper systems to be played on digital devices. Whether Roll20, Foundry VTT, fantasygrounds, MapTool, Tabletop Simulator or Tailspire, they all share a similar modus operandi. Essentially, all of them are a program that provides the graphical representation of a tabletop, a system whereby random dice results can be generated, as well as built-in assets to represent character values, an inventory, and everything else necessary. This phenomenon, the direct translation of an analog parlor game, which in other circumstances would make do with almost Spartan accessories, is worth a closer look. The question, which will be the focus of this video, refers to the distinction between analog pen and paper games and those played online. So the main topic will be to what extent the latter can be considered a video game at all, and not perhaps rather a pure 3D or 2D tool. This inquiry will be made possible by consideration based on Alexander Galloway's 4 moments theory with regard to the characteristics of the pen and paper role-playing game and VTTs in general. So let us first focus on doing the necessary groundwork and let us lay the foundation needed to undertake this investigation. But you may wonder, why even raise the question of whether a VTT could be a special case among video games at all? What exactly is a virtual tabletop, or VTT for short, that it warrants such an interest? If you find yourself answering that with "they shouldn't warrant any interest at all", then probably this video isn't for you and you could spend your time in a far more entertaining way. I suggest pouring yourself a glass of your favorite beverage, hop onto your favorite streaming site, and rewatch your favorite movie for the 3rd time. This one scene, I know it always makes you cry. But if you are interested where this line of thought can bring us to, then let us look deeper into the characteristics of video games and VTTs, even though I already explained them briefly. But we have to get a deeper understanding of the topics we are about to talk about. So let's just roll with it and look into them more closely. Again, just roll with it. And speaking of rolling with it, imagine you were rolling dice at a physical table. In contrast, the programming of a VTT would do this completely automatically after you have given it the appropriate input. A VTT also regulates the turn-based battles that underlie most pen and paper systems by always keeping track of whose turn it is. Some VTTs even depict fog, simulate the various and luminous times of day, or show the night sky. Depending on the virtual tabletop, you can also make it rain if you wish, and I'm sure many a great shaman would envy your power to do so. They simulate the light from various sources, play music if you want them to, and show how fast the character can move, i.e. how many squares he can advance on the board per turn. You can think of these squares as a pattern over each map, sometimes visible, sometimes not. This is generally called the grid, and it is used to keep track of the position of a character relative to another by assigning each square a specific amount of room. So, if we take all of these elements together, it doesn't seem to differ in many ways from classic RPG video games. Especially isometric games like Baldurs Gate, Planescape Torment, or Pillars of Eternity, with which many of us should be a bit more familiar, at least some of us. These games seem to inevitably come to mind as very similar. They also represent a translation of pen and paper systems into the video game format. There, however, lies the big difference between ISO role-playing games and a VTT. It is not their aim to provide a platform for the original systems, even though you might think that this is the case. They are mostly trying to just translate it into a video game format, and in doing so, they are more inspired by the original than actually implementing them one-to-one. So, these ISO role-playing games are just based on the original and use the same spells for the mage classes, to name just one example. But their implementation is specifically tailored to the video game format. The rules of such a spell must then be modified for this format, and in case of any doubt, some abilities are omitted entirely. In short, it can be said that this kind of implementation admits to having its own identity. The pen and paper rulebook is an inspiration that is bent to fit whenever necessary. The VTT, however, works in a completely different way. Its mechanics are built in such a way that it merely provides all the tools needed to be able to exercise the rules of the system being played. Think of it this way. Whereas in a normal RPG with pen and paper inspiration, the rules have to be bent for the program, in a VTT, the program is bent for the rules. A quick example at this point may paint a picture for you, the viewer, to exactly understand what I'm talking about. For that, let us just briefly look at the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons and the video game adaptation based on it, Baldurs Gate III. In this pen and paper system, a character can learn a wide variety of spells. Some of them are designed for combat, others for all kinds of everyday situations, and these spells are called utility spells. It is only logical that in the video game Baldurs Gate III, simple effects such as damage, teleportation, or certain strengthening, healing, or buffing properties can be represented one-to-one without major problems. But the wilder the interpretation of a spell, the less likely it is to be able to cast it appropriately into these formats. Take, for example, Mordenkainen's Magnificent Mansion, a spell from the original pen and paper D&D template.
You conjure an extra-dimensional dwelling in range that lasts for the duration. You choose where its one entrance is located. The entrance shimmers faintly and is 5 feet wide and 10 feet tall. You and any creature you designate when you cast the spell can enter the extra-dimensional dwelling as long as the portal remains open. You can open or close the portal if you are within 30 feet of it. While closed, the portal is invisible. Beyond the portal is a magnificent foyer with numerous chambers beyond. The atmosphere is clean, fresh and warm. You can create any floor plan you like, but the space can't exceed 50 cubes. Each cube being 10 feet on each side. The place is furnished and decorated as you choose. It contains sufficient food to serve a 9-course banquet for up to 100 people. A staff of 100 near-transparent servants attends all who enter. You decide the visual appearance of these servants and their attire. They are completely obedient to your orders. Each servant can perform any task a normal human servant could perform, but they can't attack or take any action that would directly harm another creature. Thus, the servants can fetch things, clean, mend, fold clothes, light fires, serve food, pour wine, and so on. The servants can go anywhere in the mansion, but can't leave it. Furnishings and other objects created by this spell dissipate into smoke if removed from the mansion. When the spell ends, any creatures inside the extra-dimensional space are expelled into the open space nearest to the entrance.
As we can see, with this spell, players conjure up a respectable mansion with everything that goes with it. Right, old sport? For a role-playing game that takes place primarily in the minds of the players and is accompanied only by a physical or virtual tabletop, this is hardly a problem, since there is a game master to prepare for that and adapt to this new situation. This event allows for completely new possibilities, but is not a deal breaker. Meanwhile, in a video game like Baldurs Gate III, we inevitably run into problems with these kinds of spells. Video games have to be prefabricated. Of course, there are several possible solutions in freely designed levels, but the framework for all possible situations has already been set in advance whenever you start a new game. A video game is made in advance. A pen and paper game is made along the way. This means that there are only two possible realities of how such a capability or spell in that matter could be approached by the developers. First, there are clearly defined points in the course of the game where such a mansion would come to be of interest and use. This would mean that there would no longer be complete freedom to use the spell whenever it suits you, as envisioned in the original. The rules would therefore have had to adapt to the programming. And the second option, the spell is considered by the developers to be too special to have wide applications in their video game. They don't go to the trouble of putting in that much extra work for just one of hundreds of abilities. Accordingly, Mordenkainen's Magnificent Mansion does not even find its way into the game. In this case, the rules also have adapted to the programming. So, the video game format comes with its own advantages, as well as its own disadvantages. We also find all these characteristics in the aforementioned isometric role-playing games. But while these inevitably pass as video games, without discussion, an unresolved and open question remains in the case of a virtual table surface. Is it really not also a video game that merely opens up other possibilities for the user in its highly specialized form? Or are VTTs still a social or board game, but with the difference that they take place in a virtual space? For example, I had a Monopoly version with a CD that you had to put into your recorder to actually play the game, as major events and building taxes would be handled over a series of cut sequences on the disc.
Welcome to Monopoly Tropical Tycoon. I'm Mr. Monopoly, your guide to this island paradise. In true Monopoly fashion, you'll be trying to amass as much wealth as possible. At the end of the game, you'll convert all of the cash and property you have into special pieces called fortune tokens. You can also earn fortune tokens throughout the game, so pay close attention to the DVD. Whoever has the most fortune tokens at the end of the game will be the winner. In addition to regular beach houses and resorts, the island offers 4 new developments: parks, casinos, piers, and restaurants. You'll learn more about these as we go along. There's a lot going on here on the island, so stay tuned to the latest news updates to help you keep afloat. All right then, players, let's see which one of you has what it takes to become a true tropical tycoon. The island awaits.
But I'm sure every one of you would agree that I would struggle with calling this a video game only because it has a virtual element. So the question is the same, really. Are VTTs still a board game, but with the difference that they take place in a virtual space? So perhaps now you understand the question a bit more. What are virtual tabletops really? Are they actually full-fledged video games? Or does it perhaps turn out in the end that a distinction is irrelevant, because there can be made none? To answer this question, obviously, a basic definition of video games is needed first, so we can highlight the possible differences between video games and their physical counterparts. Although there are many concepts of what a video game is, we will stick to using Alexander Galloway's 4 moments, a concept that divides video games into 4 specific pillars, which combine to form so-called acts. These 4 moments are pillars from which, according to Galloway, a categorization of the medium of video games from the 1970s to the turn of the millennium can be worked out. Of course, virtual tabletops only appeared much later, but I think applying Galloway's theory to programs such as VTTs can also bring us some answers to this question. And I'm sure you will witness, the theory isn't outdated at all. Moreover, the comparative nature of our investigation, which will become much more pronounced later, will make use of backward references that originated precisely in the period Galloway mentions, namely the period where pen and paper systems rose to popularity. The distinctions Galloway makes between video and board games should therefore also be applicable to these pen and paper systems. First, however, Galloway's 4 subdivisions should be explained in more detail.
One may start by distinguishing 2 basic types of action in video games. Machine actions are acts performed by the software and hardware of the game computer, while operator actions are acts performed by players. So, winning Metroid Prime is the operator's act, but losing it is the machine's. Locating a power-up in Super Mario Bros. Is an operator act, but the power-up actually boosting the player character's health is a machine act.
In the first 2 acts, as Galloway calls them, a distinction is made between the machine and the operator. The operator, according to this duality, is the actual player or human interacting with the system. Thus, if after watching this video you decide to enjoy a round of the video game of your choice, this would put you in the role of the operator. The operator definition therefore seems simple. Whether this simplicity will hold until the end of this video We will see. The machine, meanwhile, is the system, or computer, with which the operator interacts. Its range of tasks is broad. The most obvious application is the AI counterpart, which we encounter in many games. In strategy games, the machine takes over the other factions. In sports games, it takes over the other team or athlete. In racing games, it is the adversary driver. In shooters, it shoots back at us in the form of enemies. I think you get the point. But it also falls within the machine's remit to make us lose, to make us stronger, to build the game world and levels, and to present us with video sequences and crucial moments in the story. To remember this definition, one could say that everything that is not taken care of by the operator falls within the machine's remit. Even though this line can quickly become blurred.
Of course, the division is completely artificial. Both the machine and the operator work together in a cybernetic relationship to effect the various actions of the video game in its entirety. The two types of action are ontologically the same. In fact, in much of gameplay, the two actions exist as a unified, single phenomenon, even if they are distinguishable for the purpose of analysis. The categorization between machine and operator should not obscure the fact that it is still a game whose primary focus is on the perceived fun. Galloway's sober and analytical approach tries to make it all too clear that video games are software. In blunt terms, the video game Dope Wars has more in common with the finance software Quicken than it does with traditional games like chess, roulette or billiards.
It is precisely this aspect that will be the foreground for our question. Since Galloway himself makes such a strong distinction here between physical board games and video game software, it becomes all the more important to look at video game software, which sees itself as a digitized physical board game. In order for the analysis based on the four moments to be complete, however, it is necessary to take a look at the other two aspects, even if they should be far more familiar. This is the analytical distinction between diegesis and non-diegesis, and I'm sure I'm butchering those words. But Galloway borrows these terms from literature and film theory. Diegesis is the world within the narrative. Similar to film, this diegesis is formed from elements within the on-screen events shown, as well as from references to off-screen events, all of which are perceived as existing in the world of the specific incarnation of a medium. Accordingly, the diegesis forms a second reality, as Roger Caillois aptly described it according to Galloway. This very specific situation from which the event is formed always exists in a certain form or variant.
In Pong, it is a table, a ball, and two paddles. In World of Warcraft, it is two large continents with a sea in between. By contrast, non-diegetic play elements are those elements of the gaming apparatus that are external to the world of narrative action.
So basically, the diegesis is just the real universe within the film, literature, or in our case, the video game. So for example, Arthur Morgan from Red Dead Redemption 2 robbing a train is a diegetic thing, because it is inside the world. The non-diegetic elements are the opposite. Everything that is not reality within the fictional reality can be described as non-diegetic. In a video game, this includes the start and pause action in the menu or the HUD, or in broader terms, just the displays for the player. Also non-diegetic elements are the music of the multiple OSTs in video games, which accompany the action in the background. If you paid attention, you would have guessed that they only are non-diegetic because they don't happen in the reality of the fiction. If, for example, the music came from a band in a tavern and our character would also hear that music, then the music would be diegetic. Sometimes non-diegetic elements are firmly embedded in the game world. Sometimes they are entirely removed. The heads-up display, HUD, in Deus Ex is non-diegetic, while the various rooms and environments in the game are diegetic. Or in Berserk, pressing start is a non-diegetic act, whereas shooting robots is a diegetic act. But activating the slow motion effect during a gunfight is a diegetic act. However, later we will observe that this quickly can lose its clarity when confronted with certain borderline cases. A short and simple example are the pieces of music already mentioned. Background music is in itself mostly a non-diegetic element, but it inevitably enters the diegesis when it plays on the game character's radio in Grand Theft Auto, for example, as I already mentioned. At a table, there are two types of people, players and game masters. And I will just use the term game master because there are thousands of different terms for these people. Seriously. I heard that some of these games even branded their own game master term. The players have character sheets on which their values and inventories are listed. This results in their characters, which they take on as a role at a table, just like an actor. This role, or the personality of the player characters, results from the player's ideas and the backgrounds they have invented for their character. Think of it as if a scriptwriter just thought up a role and then embodied it in the plot. These players react to the world and its tasks not from their perspective, but from the perspective of their fictitious imaginary characters and declare actions from their point of view. These range from I attack to I do a double somersault and land on the guard's head to steal his helmet. This is where the people in the game master role come into play, the number of which is usually limited to one person per table group. They are the interface to the rest of the game world and take on all other roles, not played by another player at the table, whether enemy or friend. They also describe the environment and how it reacts. In other words, everything that would be regulated by the machine in a computer game. Whenever a player declares an action, the game masters can also set the framework and then describe how the action goes. Whether a player's attempt is successful is then determined by a corresponding dice roll based on an ability. For example, stealing the guard's helmet would be, in most systems, a sleight of hand check, or acrobatics because of the jump. Afterwards, the game master determines to what extent the action succeeds, how the environment reacts to it, or what other consequences the player's actions have, even if the actual success is tied to a dice roll by the player, as already mentioned. The game master must also plan quite a few hours of preparation time before the rounds, because the adventures can sometimes be purchased in ready-made form, but many rounds play stories and scenarios written by their game masters themselves. So the role of game master always comes with additional work, which is why most parties struggle to find one. I don't know, maybe you can help each other out, and if you're available for game mastering, put it down in the comments. Would really help some people, I would guess. With this knowledge in mind, the next step is to try to determine the nature of VTTs on the basis of Galloway's theory. Galloway tried to make room within his theory for the entire medium of video games. Let's see if Galloway was able to develop a theory that allows us to categorize all forms of video games, including the borderline case of VTTs. We will now focus on each of the so-called acts from Galloway's theory. These acts are always composed of the interplay of two categories of the four axes of his theory, which were recapitulated earlier in this video. On this basis, Each sub-chapter will compare physical and virtual table surfaces under one of the 4 specific aspects. Let us first look at the NonDiegetic-Operator Act. So, without further ado, let us begin and check out if VTTs are video games or something entirely different. Let us first look at the NonDiegetic-Operator Act within VTTs. This act is carried out by the operator, or to be precise, our players at the table, so probably you. This act, or rather the actions associated with it, are outside the game world, but are an integral part of the game system. Galloway himself gives the simple example of activating the pause function of a video game. But of course, this category encompasses much more. He makes clear to what extent a significant part of the NonDiegetic-Operator Act also consists of understanding and analyzing certain game-like algorithms.
All resource management simulations, as well as most real-time strategy, RTS, and turn-based games are designed in this manner. In Final Fantasy X, the process of configuring various weapons and armor, interacting with the sphere grid, or choosing how the combat will unfold are all executed using interfaces and menus that are not within the diegetic world of the game. Depending on the system, pen and paper rulebooks are also based on varying degrees of resource management. Naturally, this characteristic is also transferred to the rounds played in a VTT. In a VTT, it is specifically to be recognized in knowing and applying the rules of the respective system played. To handle one's own resources, such as magic or ammunition, or simply to roll a die. All this happens in a menu that is clearly non-diegetic. Since the question was also raised here at the beginning to what extent a VTT cannot also be regarded as a mere extension of a physical game, without the full recognition of the status of a video game, a direct comparison should always be made. The logic behind this then is this. If a VTT is to be considered a video game, but at the same time it is clear that a normal pen and paper is not, it must be possible to draw a clear distinction between the two incarnations. As it quickly becomes apparent upon a close examination of the two, this distinction is not directly given in the NonDiegetic-Operator Act. Thus, all these actions of configuration also take place at the physical table. Resources and values are recorded in a character sheet instead of menus. From a purely technical point of view, this is also outside the diegeses and is an element operated by the operator. Moreover, the menu of a VTT is often nothing more than a direct copy of the physical character sheet, made out of paper, and now made out of ones and zeros. The same problem concerns the dice checks, which are completely the same. Here, then, a VTT does not yet earn the status of a fully fledged video game, as it is too much like the physical non-video game. A difficult question, however, arises with the configurations of the game master in relation to settings around the ambience, such as light and weather. Technically speaking, these settings take place in dry menus, which are clearly outside the diegeses and cannot be found in this form on the physical table. But conversely, they form the basis on which the diegeses itself can be constructed in the first place. One could regard the physical module description, in which all this information is also recorded, as the counterpart to a menu. But ultimately the light or rain already mentioned is only generated by the verbal descriptions of the game leader at a physical table. Meanwhile, within the VTT, this can also be realized without these descriptions of the game master in the menu. But here too, wherever one wants to place this borderline case, a VTT within this category does not really differ from its analog counterpart, since one could also argue there about whether the description of the game master is inside the diegeses or outside of it. Galloway provides some clarity on this point. During level design, some machine acts are also specified. such as spawn points, lights, shaders, and hazards.
By this definition, we would have to consider a VTT's game master as part of the machine, since he prepares, embodies, and deploys much of these actions. However, declaring a human actor to be part of the machine seems not only counterintuitive, but also directly contradicting by some more of Galloway's words, albeit unconsciously, as he simply did not consider VTTs as he developed his theory. But this is our problem now to handle. The Diegetic-Operator Act is the aspect of direct interaction within the imaginary world of the game. Galloway further divides this act into two distinguishable variations. On the one hand, he names the Move Act, which can consist of movements of the game character. And on the other hand, he describes Expressive Acts, which can be found in all kinds of interaction of the player.
Move acts change the physical position or orientation of the game environment. This may mean a translation of the player's character's gaze, such that new areas of the game world are made visible. Parallel to this, in operator gameplay, is a kind of gamic act that simply concerns player expression. These are actions such as select, pick, get, rotate, unlock, open, talk, examine, use, fire, attack, cast, apply, type, emote. As on the normal table, players can also interact with their environment in a VTT or simply move around, but here they are more or less reduced to the simplest of interactions. Yet in both instances, this happens in close cooperation with the game master, whose tasks are never entirely taken over by the programming. One might first consider whether it is not already a fundamentally unique selling point, let's call it a selling point, even though I'm not selling you anything, of the digital version of a pen and paper, that the players can move to their characters across the map themselves. But this can also be realized on physical tables through miniatures. It becomes interesting when one considers that only small part of the Diegetic-Operator Act actually take place within the VTT. Most of this aspect could still be found in the interactions between players and the game master. As addressed earlier when we spoke of the counterintuitive stipulation that the game master is the machine, we get a suggestion from Galloway as to what category the game master's descriptions should actually be relegated to. Level design and all other preparations may be categorized as a machine act, but the descriptions themselves do not seem to fall into this category. Thus, Galloway mentions the nature of text adventures. So, in a text-based game like Adventure, actionable objects come in the form of specific object names that must be examined or used. These actionable objects refer to any objects with which the operator can interact. The words of the game master, however, are all to be regarded as actionable, because they are the core element of pen and paper role-playing games. It is only on the basis of a flexible game master that these role-playing games unfold their true potential. These interactions are therefore completely functional even without a VTT. At this point, one could possibly argue that a VTT is not really a fully fledged video game, but rather only a mere extension of the physical role-playing game. The devil may not be in the detail here, but certainly in the comparison. Because the argument could also be applied in exactly the same way to role-playing communities of existing video games. For example, large groups often form around games like Grand Theft Auto 5 or Arma, which misuse the basic game and replace the actual gameplay with external role-playing. But basically, they are all still playing a video game, without question. Where before they simply shot each other, now they start talking and then decide if they want to shoot. These interactions of the external roleplay would also be functional without the digital component of the game.
as a playful form of improv and amateur theater, but this fact does not deprive them of their video game status. And I'm sure almost all of you will agree on this. If someone is playing GTA roleplay, then he's still playing a video game, right? A VTT seems to fall into a similar niche. On the basis of these actionable objects, however, one can make a big distinction between analog and digital pen and paper rounds. The VTT level itself introduces actionable objects that can be clearly separated from the words of the game master. Take doors, for example, which can be opened and closed independently. They have an interaction possibility provided for and integrated by the programming. This fundamentally distinguishes the door from objects that are merely static parts of the environment. For example, the difference between these two doors. One is actionable, the other is clearly not. On a physical table, you would only have two doors, and both of them would probably be actionable because the game master just described the scene and said there are two doors. Of course, you can also go into the other, but now the VTT is separate from this, and in the VTT, one door is clearly not actionable. This again clearly shows the limiting aspect of programmed environments, which has already been illustrated with Mordenkainen's magnificent mansion. Interaction in programmed space must be largely anticipated, otherwise it does not take place. Of course, the game master can react freely and flexibly to any action and adapt the course of the game, so even the non-actionable door can, in the course of the pen and paper roleplay, be actionable, but not in the VTT itself, because the VTT itself is not able to do this. This is a typical characteristic of a video game, as was pointed out at the beginning. But before making a conclusion, let us look at the other remaining acts and categories. The next act we will focus on is the Non-Diegetic-Machine Act. Probably the clearest indicator of this act is the game over screen. However, such a screen does not exist in any normal VTT, as the playful aspect in pen and paper role-playing games is never completely stopped. The end of a game session should not be understood as a Non-Diegetic Machine Act, since the players and game masters decide themselves when this happens. At no point would the game system, i.e. the machine, interrupt the action on its own. Other components of the Non-Diegetic Machine Act quickly become apparent, which can certainly be assigned to a VTT.
Included here are internal forces like power-ups, goals, high score stats, dynamic difficulty adjustments, DDA, the HUD, and health packs, but also external forces exerted by the machine, such as software crashes, low polygon counts, temporary freezes, server downtime, and network lag.
So, you simply cannot ignore the HUD within the VTT. Bugs and glitches also fall into this category. And just like any other program, VTTs are susceptible to all kinds of glitches. All these factors set the virtual table apart from the analog table. There is no HUD on our living room table. Even if one wants to call the physical character sheets of such pen and paper role-playing games a HUD, it must be noted that a character sheet in the VTT can also exist independently and in addition to other HUD elements. A menu for dice selection, for example, or slider for different zoom levels. Arguments against this could be made to regard these elements as mere translations of the physical and not to grant VTT's video game status on the basis of this functionality alone. The dice selection in the menu would thus be a translation of the hand reaching for the corresponding plastic die. The zoom controls are then the translation of the player's position above the table, who can freely move his head and thus his gaze. However, the analog table has neither bugs nor glitches. At least as long as we are talking about a normal table without technical plugins. Again, one can try to make the previous argument, but this inevitably becomes more difficult. because this act is well motivated in gameplay. But in many cases, non-diegetic machine acts are consummately unplay, particularly when dealing with crashes and lags. At a physical table, there are never such extreme debilitating moments that do not also simultaneously emanate from or directly affect the operator. In short, a VTT can crash without the operator's intervention, but a module manual, for example an adventure book, cannot be damaged or destroyed without the influence of an external operator. The more positive characteristics of the Non-Diegetic Machine Act are information, skills and level ups. So those things that advance the game rather than hinder it. These can be found in both incarnations of pen and paper role-playing games. So from these points it is not really possible to decide whether a VTT is or is not considered a video game. The fact is that there is virtually no difference between the physical and virtual variants. In pen and paper, all these aspects come directly from the operator, or more precisely from the players and game masters. But it is precisely the phenomena mentioned first, those of technical fallibility, that seem to represent an insurmountable gap between analog and virtual tables. It is true that something can break every now and then at an analog table, but a printed rulebook or a 20-sided die will not just suddenly fail to work and crash, such as a VTT could do. Lastly, the final break of whether or not to call them video games may be found in the Diegetic-Machine Act, our last act. Within the VTT, we encounter it in the form of flickering animated fires or in preset camera movements. When games are left alone, they often settle into a moment of equilibrium, not a tape loop or a skipped groove, but a state of rest. The game is slowly walking in place, shifting from side to side and back again to the center.
It is running, playing itself perhaps. The game is in an ambient state, an ambience act. It rains, the sun goes down, then it comes up, trees stir. The game is still present, but play is absent. The ambience act is the machine's act. The user is on hold, but the machine keeps on working.
These moments simply do not exist on physical tables. Galloway describes this act as either missing the operator or, in the case of cinematic sequences, forgetting about him. This is impossible in an analog role-playing game from the ground up. Without their operators in the form of players and game masters, the game stops completely. The VTT, meanwhile, technically continues without an active operator, even if there is not much happening on the screen. It does not cease to exist without the game master, unlike the game in physical space. Of course, to counter this argument, one could declare the game master as a machine and not as an operator. That this problem of precise definition arises in many ways should also have become clear by now. The semantic difficulty can be brought up again and again. Subsequently, a relatively strong line of argument could also be formed if Galloway's definitions themselves were to be called into question. Then, one could simultaneously prefer the thought that even in an analog role-playing game, the players can certainly keep the game active without their game master, namely through interactions between themselves. But to fully engage in this debate, Galloway's definitions of machine and operator would inevitably need to be shaken up. Something that has been hinted at throughout this video, but on which we will not focus further. It is sufficient to provide this food for thought. Anything else would far go beyond any time limit I set myself for this video. Thus, when Galloway speaks of the machine being up and running, no more and no less, it can be said that this is only possible within the VTT, but not at an ordinary table. The torch that lights up the room continues to shine in a VTT, even if all the operators have already left the table. In comparison, a physical session requires a verbal and active description and interaction of the operators with the torch, for the torch to be there. So, the conclusion, depending on how much one stretches Galloway's definitions, seems to be very sobering. Although, at first glance, clear distinctions can be drawn between the VTT and similar programs and the living room table, none of them are unassailable statements. The borderline case of the virtual table possibly inspires subjective redefinitions of Galloway's 4 moments. In theory, a VTT can easily be described as a video game on the basis of the unique characteristics mentioned here. Since many of the acts a video game requires to be a video game can be found in a VTT and not in their counterparts that are played on a normal table. But it is equally possible to reinterpret Galloway's 4 pillars by directly comparing and retracting them to the physical pen and paper. Following this line of thought, a VTT could arguably also be described as a mere program, as a software or tool for tabletop role-playing games, completely without the connotation of being a video game in its own right. But one should keep in mind that Galloway also sees mere financial software as a closer relative of the video game than the board games or parlor games on our physical tables. Based on this perspective, the results of this video can be understood as an endorsement that a virtual tabletop is indeed a video game. Too many elements that can only be attributed to a VTT alone point to its different nature compared to ordinary pen and paper rounds played on a physical table. There is no doubt the underlying problem will probably always be that the core of the question can be traced back to semantics. With such a subjective question, it is questionable whether an undisputed and final definition can ever be made. At this point, I think we can find a middle ground by saying that the more mature and developed the mechanics of a VTT are, the clearer the classification as a video game will become. Because the core characteristic is and remains the pre-programmability of interaction. The complexity of built-in VTT mechanics that are exclusive to the technical programs provides that, while a normal pen and paper game in the physical world has no such elements. This video has been in the making for quite some time. I believe it was around spring last year that I started to animate this, and God, it was really hard work. I completely underestimated this amount of keyframing I needed to do for this to work the way I wanted it to work. And now we're here, finally. I think it really was worth the time, and I hope you do too, because in the end, this wasn't made for me, but because I just wanted to tell you things I love talking about anyway. So the one thing I really learned was that there will be more of these. Maybe not exactly like these, because I have to figure out what I want to do next as in regards of topics. I can imagine myself doing something on TTRPGs again. I can imagine myself doing something on real life lore, not the channel, but real life events or something like that. Maybe with a humorous spin, we will see. Maybe there's already something for you to find here. We don't know. When are you watching this? This came out 2023. What time have we now? Dear time traveler, I don't know. You're the master of disaster. You're in control of time, not me. No, I'm not. Well, anyway. If you want to, and if you are able to understand German, I know it's a hard ask, but if you are able to, then check out our other channel where I and my buddy Alex, we are spending some quality time with each other, talking about our favorite topics like games, movies, and TV. And we also have some reactions over there, so even if you don't understand German, try it out. You can interpret our faces for your favorite scenes, I guess, if that is something you like. But don't expect heavily edited stuff. This will be kept around this channel, and over there's just fun and games. So, if you want fun and games, check out the Bluebird channel down in the description or somewhere on this YouTube page. And if you want to stay updated for the next video, then yeah, you know the game. I won't ask you for all the things. Do the things. You know the things. Things. You know them. Yeah. And if not, well, I do hope we see each other in the next video anyway. I won't disturb you no more. See you later, alligator.